Advanced Study. Some of you may know that the Institute for Advanced Study has been an institution at Indiana University for about 20 years. We do many things. One of the newer things that we've been involved in are a series of inter and transdisciplinary seminars on a number of different subjects. Graduate students are sometimes involved in these. Some of the topics that we are currently running these seminars on: energy, translation, life writing, women in the curriculum, cultural theory, the African diaspora, history of the book. It's in many ways an intellectual feast. And for those of you who are faculty persons, I invite you very much to consider ways in which you might develop a seminar that would be of interest to graduate students as well as to fellow faculty. Of course, the bedrock of the Institute for Advanced Study has been a program to bring visiting fellows here. They come for a period of 2 or 3 weeks to consult and collaborate with faculty, an individual faculty person or a group of faculty. One of the few things that we ask that a visiting fellow do is to give a public lecture. And this, of course, is the public lecture for our visiting fellow this week. That he can also serve as a keynote speaker for a broader gathering makes this particular afternoon event even more rich. I'm pleased now to turn things over to Tammy Berberi, who will welcome you on behalf of the Department of Colloquy, and then to Margot Gray, who will give the introduction to our speaker.
I'm Tammy Berberi. I'm not wearing my name tag yet, but if I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, I'd like to welcome you all to the 10th annual, 10th annual graduate student colloquium in French and Italian. It's a lot. And I hope you'll really enjoy yourselves this weekend. And if anyone can do anything for you, please let us know. I'd also like to thank the faculty of our department for being very supportive, as always, of our concerns and projects, and also graduate students and colleagues for being very involved in the colloquium organization. So thank you very much. Now this is Margot Gray.
Yes, thank you. I also haven't yet managed to put on my name tag. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. And first of all, our very grateful thanks to the Institute for Advanced Study for their very kind invitation and hospitality to Dr. Edward Hughes, and for the opportunity this represents for all of us this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Edward Hughes, Eddie, as he asked to be called. He completed his BA at Queen's University, Belfast, with first-class honors in both French and Spanish, before completing his PhD also at Queen's University, Belfast. He then took up a position at the University of London, at Birkbeck College, and he's still with the University of London, now with Royal Holloway, where his title is Reader. I particularly like this title because, of course, as you know, here in the States, we're all professors of various shades and stripes. We profess, which sounds to me a little bit chatty and risks sounding a little bit vapid, I have to say. Whereas in the UK system, there are very few professors and more readers, which sounds somehow more profound and more authentic. And the only inconvenience I understand from Eddie is that his parents aren't terribly impressed because for them, he's always been a reader. He has published most extensively on Proust and Camus, but also on other 20th century writers the poet Victor Ségalen and the writer Marguerite Duras. In his very early work, I'm thinking here of a book published with Cambridge when I believe he was only 29, rather a depressing thought, I think, but in this early book, he thinks about more introspective issues involving self-consciousness as a possible source of the aesthetic, and, for example, he reads Proust's writing against Proust's own criticism. But from that sort of position, he has moved increasingly into more socio-cultural and socio-political questions and interests, as we see in his most recent book, also with Cambridge University Press, and in fact, so recently that its official publication date was just last Sunday, called Writing Marginality in Modern French Literature, from Loti to Genet. Very lovely photograph here of Pierre Loti in Arab dress, a nice example of what he calls cultural transvestism. Anyway, in this book, he thinks about issues of centrality and marginality, and the ways in which both canonical and non-canonical writers negotiate these issues in the context of coloniality. And as I understand, his talk this afternoon is going to pursue the meditation that opens up in this book. Now, before I cede the floor here, I just wanted to warn you very briefly that Eddie, as an Irish national working in London, is very much at home in all levels of English. However, American as a language, American English, although nowadays in French you see traduit de l'américain, so American officially exists as a language, still poses one or two occasional challenges for him, as I discovered last weekend when we were both out at the big annual colloquium in our field, the International Colloquium in 20th Century French Studies. This year, which met out at the University of California, Davis. At one point, when I ran into Eddie, he started talking about the wonderful, delicious, delectable hash browns. And I was impressed at this and thought, how sensible. Here's somebody who, despite the demands of a very busy conference with sessions, beginning at 8:30 a.m., here's somebody who takes the time to have a hearty breakfast. But there was one element that was slightly strange in the hash browns discourse, and that was that it was in the singular, as in a wonderful, delectable hash brown, the wonderful, delectable hash brown. And this did seem a little bit strange, but I thought perhaps this Irish national has simply been living in England too long, become so controlled and so restrained that he only allows himself, here in hedonistic California, he only allows himself one hash brown. But this just seemed too pitiful a plight to contemplate, so I was stymied until it came to me. That afternoon, during the coffee break, the organizers of the conference had put out, along with the coffee, a huge platter, not of hash browns, but of brownies. And so I had the delicate mission of explaining to Eddie that he hadn't been eating what he thought he had. And thankfully, I think he adjusted to the trauma quite well. So do join me, I'm sorry, his title this afternoon, let me just give you that, is The Betrayal of the Occident, Cultural Difference, Illusion, and Self-Definition in Modern French Literature. And now do join me in welcoming to the States the land of hash browns and brownies, preferably in equally massive quantities, in welcoming to Indiana University and to Bloomington, Dr. Edward Hughes.
Thanks very much, Margot, for those kind words of introduction. This lecture is going to be about French authors and not about me. You'll be relieved to know. I'd also like to begin by thanking warmly Professor Mary Ellen Brown at the Institute of Advanced Study for her very kind invitation to be here. It's a great honor, and I am, comment on dirait en français, sensible à l'importance de cette occasion. Enfin, dans ma vie professionnelle. So, warm thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank Professor Margot Gray for having kindly acted as my sponsor and shown much kindness and hospitality. And also I'd like to thank Tammy Burberry, who liaised with me about this conference and who kindly encouraged me to give a paper that would, let's say, fit a number of bills. So my thanks to you all. A bit louder? Yeah, fine. The title I've chosen for today's lecture contains strong language. The Betrayal of the Occident, even though there's a question mark in there. So too does the work of Jean Genet, under whose influence I concocted my title. In Genet we read, Il faudrait plus que haïr, plus que vomir la France. I.e., you would need not just to hate France, not just to vomit it up. How feasible is that? How possible is it for a Francophobia cultivated in France, even in someone like Jean Genet, a child, as he says, of l'assistance publique, to deliver radical cultural evacuation? Or is such iconoclasm destined to be recuperated within an adaptable cultural consensus that can mop up ideological contradiction on the way? In other words, is Genet's cultural aggression a tolerable dissidence that society permits, using it even as a safety valve to confirm it in its own cultural ways? Rather like those carnivals in which the world order is upturned, but only for a day, before returning to the established social order. If I may go on using strong language, here's another one-liner that paints an even more negative picture of France. Je meurs de la France. That's to say, I'm dying because of France. France, if you like, is killing me. You might say that Genet's vomiting has become something altogether more terminal. Yet, to find the author of this last quotation, we need not to look into Genet's grave in Morocco, but in the direction of another apparently dissident Frenchman who also chose to have his ashes buried in his beloved adoptive Morocco, where they were placed in a fine mausoleum at Rabat in 1934. When Morocco became independent in 1956, these remains were returned to France, to no less a privileged cultural center than Les Invalides. Visitors to that museum are generally in such a hurry to see the tomb of Napoleon I, at least I was, that they could be forgiven for thinking that he is the only great Frenchman to be buried there. But before descending to the burial vault where Napoleon lies, we pass by another burial monument to the author of our quotation, Je meurs de la France. The soldier in question is Louis Hubert Gonzalve Lyautey, who played a central role in the history of French colonization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and who rose to the heady rank of Maréchal de France. He served in Indochina and Madagascar in the 1890s, and then in Algeria, before becoming resident general in the French Protectorate of Morocco between 1912 and 1925. His colonial career was to leave him adrift from the ways of metropolitan France. he regularly wrote of the relief he experienced at getting back to Morocco. And when his ashes were moved to the Invalides in 1961, President Charles de Gaulle, who attended the ceremony, referred to Lyautey's greatness and underscored the sensitivity that he, Lyautey, had shown to the cultures of the colonized peoples of Indochina and the Maghreb. Lyautey cautions against French cultural supremacism of a flagrant kind, and he promoted a form of paternalism with notions of social, moral, and economic betterment. Supremacism, he insists, leads to moral crisis and political malaise in the colonies. I quote, "The explanation lies in our tendency to consider as inferior those races placed under our authority. It is unjust," he says, "to treat Berbers, Annamites, and Arabs with a disdain and a condescension that incite hatred and store up future revolts." One of the principal theorists then of the French colonial expansion, one of its leading soldier administrators, Lyautey is the exponent of an ostensibly benign colonialist engagement. Not that this prevented him from using military might in pursuit of French goals in those colonial spaces that made up what was gloriously referred to as la plus grande France. So wedded was Lyautey to the colonial ways of North Africa that he earned the nickname Lyautey l'Africain. The grandeur and megalomania of his vision are perhaps best captured in the words of the colonialist writer Claude Farrère, who in 1922 observed, "At the present time, our Africa cannot do without Lyautey l'Africain. In truth, one cannot avoid the comparison," he says, "between Scipio, conqueror of Carthage, and Lyautey, conqueror of Fez and Marrakech." Lyautey's appetite for colonial adventure is captured in the language used to describe his early unofficial incursions from Algeria into Morocco. That's prior to the establishment of the French protectorate in Morocco in 1912. I quote, he uses the term pénétration discrète. "This pénétration discrète of Morocco, which I began clandestinely and which has scarcely begun, is so passionate a feeling that to leave would be truly a cruel disappointment for me." An implicitly feminized Morocco, then, acts like an aphrodisiac on its future protector. That the colonial enterprise is more wedded to self-indulgent adventurism than fraternal cooperation is evident in Lyautey's description of his official installation in Marrakech in 1912, where he is received by local tribal leaders. We read, "I have been living in a fairy tale land for the last 10 days. There is no oriental picture which could portray what I have seen since my arrival at Marrakech on that sunny morning. The Arab multitudes, the colorful horsemen, the large military standards, the continuous parades, the joyous fanfares of our troops, the perfume and liveliness of victory, the backdrop of the snow-covered high Atlas Mountains, and the encampment of the victorious column in the Sultan's gardens, the reception of the officers in a palace drowned in verdure." Lyautey's evocation is stereotypically exoticist, with several key tropes. The other seen as multitude, the emphasis on native color and spectacle, the seduction of the French conqueror by the lush natural surroundings, the intoxication that comes with colonial power. Note the reference to this perfume and liveliness of victory. The effect is of a heady cocktail of superficial cultural difference and military power thrown together, a form, if you like, of colonial kitsch. There is no encounter with the other, rather a vaguely delineated other serves to confirm the Westerner in his position of cultural hegemony. Yet Lyautey eventually had to forego these exoticist fantasies. Years later, when no longer serving in Africa, he was to lament the path taken by France in the interwar years. His aristocratic ways, which colonial hierarchy so facilitated, left him ill-equipped to readjust to life in metropolitan France. He masterminded the Exposition Coloniale in 1931 with its paternalist didacticism. It was organized at Vincennes in the working-class southeastern Parisian suburb, where today we still have a museum on the site of the exhibition. And Lyautey's design was, as he conceived it, to encourage the working class of that suburb and of the capital more generally to turn their backs on communism once they had sampled the images of colonialism on view at the exhibition. The extravaganza promised to take its visitors on, quote, a tour of the world in a day, and its success, there were 500,000 people on the last day alone of opening in November 1931, demonstrates how Lyautey was tapping into a deep vein of popular approval for colonialism. And yet, on his deathbed, Lyautey is reported to have complained, "Je meurs de la France." The disillusionment is that of the returning soldier come exoticist, who still harks back to the glory days of la plus grande France, the days of empire, and who is unable to adjust to the ways of la petite France. But his words signal how the exotic experience of colonial soldiery unsettles the perception of the West. Understandably, de Gaulle did not remind his audience at the ceremony at Les Invalides of Lyautey's attributed dying words. Had Lyautey said more conveniently and patriotically, "Je meurs pour la France," that might have been different. It would certainly have given the president a resonant soundbite. But I want to take his "Je meurs de la France" and "Genèse, il faut vomir la France" as points of departure for some reflections on figures in modern French literature in whose works we see unfolding an uneasy connection with the French cultural legacy that has shaped them. The first of my authors is Pierre Loti, whose, as Margot says, his photograph is on the front of the Cambridge book that has just come out. Like Lyautey, he was a colonial officer. He was a naval officer who saw service in French Indochina and Africa. Like Lyautey too, he came to be elected to the Académie Française. And like Lyautey, he also called for cultural tolerance in France's program of colonialist expansion. At Merz-el-Kébir, for example, in North Africa in 1869, he witnesses the hunger and dispossession in Arab encampments and laments, I quote, "Ces débris d'une nation puissante qui succombe aujourd'hui, comme autrefois les Natchez et tant d'autres, sous la main de notre civilisation envahissante et impitoyable." The remains then of a powerful nation that today succumbs, like the Natchez and so many others before it, to the merciless invasion of our civilization. In 1883, when the French colonial expedition to Tonkin in Southeast Asia went disastrously wrong with the deaths of thousands of Annamites and also young Breton soldiers, Loti wrote unsigned articles for Le Figaro in which he describes in lurid detail the massacre of Annamite civilians. His outspoken journalism fueled intense criticism of the government of the day, and indeed hastened his own recall. In real life, he was the Lieutenant Julien Viau, and the government quickly got him back from the front line. The Annam scandal of 1883 indicates that far from cynically endorsing colonial policy, Loti was actively informing a domestic public through the pages of Le Figaro of the realities of war in Indochina. His campaigning journalism, nevertheless, doesn't undo the racist stereotyping that we see in his fiction. But it shows how within late 19th century French culture, we have these eccentric, ambiguous voices decrying colonial excesses while simultaneously articulating the crude ethnic prejudice of their day. Loti's literary success was considerable and his influence widespread. His novel Le Mariage de Loti, a romantic drama set in Polynesia, in which the European sailor finds a native Polynesian bride, was a bestseller, running to more than 75 editions and becoming a standard work of reference for those embarking on colonial service. But I want to focus on another of his novels, Aziyadeh, set in Istanbul in the mid-1870s at the time of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. Here too, a Western European male protagonist falls in love with a native woman, a love described in exoticist terms and culminating in the death of Aziyadeh. Loti, the male protagonist, envisages almost instantaneous forms of cultural inclusion. His cultivation of superficiality is practiced in a disarmingly self-aware way. The injection of theatricality and aggressive promotion of surface textures suggests an effortless cultural appropriation. The transparency of the gestures is captured in an episode of dress switching in a cafe in the Galata quarter of Istanbul. Loti writes, «J'entrais en vêtements européens par la grande porte et je sortais en turc par l'impasse. I go through the main door dressed as a European and leave as a Turk onto the cul-de-sac at the back. He simply changes dress. The correlative to this cultural transvestism is his promotion of a regressive politics. The novel denigrates contemporary Europe and more precisely French Republican democracy. We should remember the fledgling democracy of the Third French Republic here, bearing in mind that Aziyadeh was published in 1879. Scenes in the Turkish cafes where pashas and ordinary folk meet are idealized by Loti, who exclaims, «Ô égalité, inconnue à notre nation démocratique, à nos républiques occidentales». In Loti's manipulative, perverse pseudo-ethnography, Ottoman hierarchy then becomes egalitarian. He commends the vigorous discussion of political developments in popular circles in Turkey and contrasts this with what he sees as the apathy in equivalent groups back home. Loti rails against his own cultural legacy. J'ai horreur de tout travail qui n'est pas du corps et des muscles, horreur de toute science, haine de tous les devoirs conventionnels, de toutes les obligations sociales de nos pays d'Occident. The cult of the body and the devaluation of intellect are the symptoms then of what Roland Barthes, in a brilliant essay on Aziyadeh, calls Loti's social irresponsibility. Istanbul then becomes the site for Loti's attempt at betraying the Occident. But it is a betrayal, a defection that is predicated on illusion. Thus, in the denouement of the novel, Loti, the protagonist, pulls on the uniform of the soldier of the Ottoman Empire and craves a glorious and sacrificial death on the battlefield. It is a magical outcome which the fiction duly delivers, and we see in the last chapter of the text the reporting in the Turkish press of the death of Arif Effendi, that's to say Loti, our European protagonist. Like Lyautey's triumphant entry into Marrakech, Loti's self-transformation owes more to fantasy than to any relational engagement with otherness. This claimed evacuation of the self and the erasure of social responsibility confirm what is an implausible cultural migration. The conflation of surface and being in Asiade is picked up by Barthes, who enthuses, I quote, "The person is nothing but this desired image which the garment permits us to believe in. And the Turk of the old days that Loti longs to be is, in Barthes' words, a man of pure desire, cut loose from the Occident and from modernism, insofar as, in the eyes of a modern Occidental, one and the other are identified with the very responsibility of living." Projection and fantasy, then, rather than relationality, are the motivating forces in Loti's quest. To what extent does Loti's claimed cultural defection amount to an engagement with cultural difference? Hardly at all, you will say, in that what we have seen is unilateral fantasy. And yet, interestingly, in Turkey today, Pierre Loti enjoys a favorable reputation. He's a recognized Turkophile figure. If I could just interject here with an anecdote. I remember in a small cafe in South London, run by a Turkish family, one day I said to them, I can't speak a single word of Turkish. And then I thought, there is one word in Turkish which I know, taught to me indirectly by Loti, the word eski, when this kind of cultivation of the archaic and the ancient. So I said to them, eski. And they said, ah, yes, the ancient. How do you know that? And I said, well, it's a French author whom I've read, but you will never have heard of him. And they said, and the name of this French author? And I said, it's Loti. And they said, Pierre Loti. But have we heard of Pierre Loti? And they sort of waxed lyrical about Loti being a great Turkophile. And yeah. So it left me kind of wondering, was I right simply to dismiss Loti as a fly-by-night Occidental exoticist, you know, lightly touching down and then rushing way back to France? And their intervention made me think that perhaps it's less cut and dried than I had been counting on. Another question is exotic appropriation necessarily condemned to being an act of bad faith? Is it always going to be an empty gesture, a form, if you like, of intransitivity, where nothing passes through in terms of cultural relation? In this consideration of late 19th century marginality, I also want to consider the painter and writer Paul Gauguin. Here too, a quest for some form of consolation beyond Europe is enacted. While Polynesia is Gauguin's place of compensation and archaism, he too uses the language of compensatory other times and spaces in his Tahitian diary, Noa Noa. Before leaving for the Pacific in 1892, Gauguin had found inspiration in the Exposition Universelle of 1889. He exhibited there, he was part of a groupe impressionniste et synthétiste, but he was intrigued by another incongruous exhibit involving several hundred tribespeople from Dakar, New Caledonia and Saigon, people whose habitats were reconstructed on the Champ de Mars. The numbers flocking to see these emblems of difference confirm a metropolitan need for crude cultural simplification. While Gauguin's own decision to go to Oceania a couple of years later may be seen as further indulging that curiosity. In cavalier fashion, he claims direct access to the primitive, assuming the mantle of the sauvage and surrendering gloriously, as he fantasizes, to a higher Maori authority. Je tenais le pinceau, les dieux Maori dirigeaient ma main, he writes. I held the brush, and the Maori gods directed my hand. Admittedly, Gauguin does criticize many aspects of French colonial culture, He rejects as rank hypocrisy the claims of the liberté, égalité, fraternité in a colonial context. He pours scorn on what he refers to as the machine infernale of the Catholic Church, the church that denigrated the native art of the Marquesas Islands. But this doesn't exonerate Gauguin from the cultural predation that we also see in Loti. In an unapologetic usurpation of otherness, Gauguin exploits Polynesia to enhance his profile as primitive sauvage. He was a consummate self-publicist. In 1891, before leaving Paris, he writes, Je pars pour être tranquille, pour être débarrassé de l'influence de la civilisation. J'ai besoin de me retremper dans la nature vierge, de ne voir que des sauvages, de vivre leur vie, sans autre préoccupation que de rendre, comme le ferait un enfant, les conceptions de mon cerveau avec l'aide seulement des moyens d'art primitifs, les seuls vrais. Cultural historians see in this late 19th century avant-gardism a preparation for the modern, the cultural spin-offs from colonial conquest epitomizing an important realignment, hence the ethnographic museums, the artifacts of colonized peoples, and the vogue for Darwin-inspired theories of evolution. Gauguin assertively foregrounds an antithetical model between civilized and savage. He writes in 1895 to August Strindberg, the Swedish writer, of Le choc entre votre civilisation et ma barbarie, civilisation dont vous souffrez, barbarie qui est pour moi un rajeunissement. The figure of Josepha, Gauguin's Polynesian companion in Noa Noa, is described not only as a primitive, but also as a child. Josepha congratulates Gauguin on Gauguin's social usefulness. Thus, what Europe castigates as Gauguin's moral irresponsibility converts into recognition of apparent social service as an artist. A claimed new order, then, based on an infantilized, savage other, gives the artist a prestige that adult, civilized Europe appears to withhold. How do we read, then, this overstated Europhobia? It is, as I say, reminiscent of Loti and his protestations about an oppressive cultural legacy. Yet there is little evidence that this refusal of the West translates into dialectical engagement with the other. Rather, what Gauguin's exile does is to placate a Western need for the exotic, a need that is arguably part and parcel of consensus itself. His friend and agent Daniel de Montfried explains to Gauguin in 1902 that Gauguin's reputation in Paris rests precisely on the belief that he has achieved some form of seamless insertion into the culture of Oceania, that he is indeed the cultural dissident gone native. Not surprisingly, any talk from Gauguin about returning home, and there was a lot of talk along those lines, unsettles de Montfried, who rushes to tell him, you must stay where you are, and I quote, it is to be feared that your coming back would disturb the work of incubation taking place in the public with regard to you. You are currently the legendary, unheard of artist who dispatches his disconcerting, inimitable works from farthest Oceania, the definitive works of a great man who has disappeared, as it were, from the world. In short, de Montfried says, you enjoy the immunity of the glorious deceased. You have passed into the history of art. And in the meantime, he says, the public is learning to appreciate your work. Exile from Europe is thus described as a form of glorious death, as bringing immunity from the everyday, and as a guarantee of status. But crucially, we have the commercially central place of the exoticized margins. In this scenario, the claimed Betrayal of the West has commodity value, with Paris, the cultural capital of the 19th century, educating the appetite for what is deemed to be peripheral. In his cultural iconoclasm, Gauguin anticipates arguments that are to feature in Freud's essay Civilization and its Discontents. Freud's thesis is well known, that innate human aggression acts potentially as a giant obstacle to culture, and that the same aggression, channeled through the superego, can be directed punitively against the ego. I quote from Freud, "Civilization therefore obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming in it, and by setting up an agency within him to keep watch over it like a garrison in a conquered city." In contrast, Gauguin proposes a tropical idyll in which libidinal drives are freely explored. Significantly, Freud contests the assertion that the primitive mindset is uninhibited and thus superior. He dismisses as exoticist fallacy the assumption that the colonized lead more fulfilled and simple lives away from the complications of civilization. He takes his corrective further, arguing that the mature ego must repudiate the oceanic, that's to say, the feeling of limitlessness in which the separation between the ego and the world is blurred. Freud's model is useful in that it draws us back to the sites of internally generated European fantasy. It cautions against equating this with an empathic cultural engagement with the other. His point is applicable to the success enjoyed in France by both Loti and Gauguin. Or, to put it slightly differently, Loti and Gauguin, their productions provide a channel for self-exploration and for experimentation beyond moral restriction. Freud's own view encompasses both colonial history and theories of repression when he argues, and I quote, "Civilization behaves towards sexuality as a people or a stratum of its population does, which has subjected another people to its exploitation." In this scenario, Gauguin's aggressive marginality acts as a pretext or cover for sexual predation in the colony. I want to digress here briefly, if I may, in order to reconstruct the itinerary that led me to write the book, Writing Marginality in Modern French Literature. In the initial stages of my research, I was not working at all on strong forms of exoticist marginality of the kind exemplified by Loti and Gauguin. Rather, it started serendipitously, as it were, with Proust, an author more immediately associated with Paris and with the bourgeois and aristocratic spaces of that capital, rather than with the colony. Yet what is striking in À la recherche du temps perdu is that when Proust sets about his description of homosexuality, he practices a kind of mapping that almost haphazardly leads him to summon up non-European spaces. In this light, Europe becomes a site of heterosexist consensus. If Gauguin's sexual liberation takes him to Tahiti, Proust aims to accommodate homosexuality overseas. Hence the arresting quotation as Proust's narrator puzzles over how he might represent this form of sexual alterity. A brief quotation. Peut-être pour les peindre, c'est-à-dire peut-être pour peindre les homosexuels, faut-il penser, sinon, it's very shocking what I'm about to read, faut-il penser sinon aux animaux qui ne se domestiquent pas, aux lionceaux prétendus apprivoisés mais restés lions, du moins aux noirs, que l'existence confortable des blancs désespère et qui préfèrent les risques de la vie sauvage et ses incompréhensibles joies. Which in translation reads, perhaps to form a picture of the homosexual, We ought to think, if not of the wild animals that never become domesticated, of the lion cubs allegedly tamed, which are still lions at heart, then at least of the blacks, whom the comfortable existence of the white man renders desperately unhappy, and who prefers the risks of life in the wild and its incomprehensible joys. Critics, not surprisingly, have not been in a great hurry to pick up on this passage with its gross provocation. Proust floats a crude animal analogy before abandoning it, replacing it with a no less dubious comparison between homosexual and black African. At a time when the European colonization of Africa was at its height, Proust uses the colony in which to simulate the conditions of extreme danger facing the homosexual, now cast as the colonized contending with invasion. In the narrator's fantastic sexual geography, which is inflected by the racism of his day, Africa becomes an idealized space in which heroic blacks, repelled by images of white comfort, are the risk takers. Homosexuals are similarly outraged by heterosexual ease. The opposition, while flawed with the essentialism fundamental to racism, becomes heavily moralized with its insistence on the imaginative and ethical superiority of black and homosexual asceticism. As with Gauguin and Loti, Proust's association of the other with sexual desire is random and predatorial. Yet in looking beyond what he presents as a heterosexist Europe, he reinforces the tradition whereby the forbidden is regularly accommodated beyond the West. In the case of the homosexual in La Recherche du Temps Perdu, sexual self-definition is thus caught up in a permissive colonial imaginary. Projecting onto the black African the otherness of this aberrant, in inverted commas, desire is, of course, wholly and scandalously arbitrary. The link has meaning, but only as a syllogism might, in that we might say that for the European mindset of Proust's day, Africa and perceived aberrant sexuality are both consigned to the order of taboo, to the fantastic, the unspoken. Moreover, the connection signals only a feigned reciprocity, for unbeknown to himself, the African is here the mute third party in a triangle designed to deliver collusion between Proust's narrator and his bourgeois reader. I now want to come back to Jean Genet, an author well familiar with notions of sexual and cultural marginality. Indeed, his trademark, as we have already seen, is precisely the bold, hostile sloganizing about the West. Writing in a state of shock following the killing of the black activist George Jackson in San Quentin prison in 1971, Genet, who actively collaborated with the Black Panthers, called on Western radicals to contest the mythologies on which white dominance was based. He says, "Il faut apprendre à trahir les blancs que nous sommes." We must learn to betray the whites that we are. Genet's outspokenness is unsurprising when we remember his reputation as cultural dissident in France. A reputation established through such plays as Le Balcon, with its merciless critique of bourgeois inauthenticity, and Les Paravents, the riot-inducing play that depicted so irreverently the French war effort during the Algerian War. The legacy of Western domination, Genet argues, disfigures those who perpetuate it. But the incitement to cultural self-betrayal regularly finds overdetermined expression in Genet. One senses that he would have been quite proud to have coined Lyautey's little line, "Je meurs de la France." It's odd in a way, I suppose, throwing together a Maréchal de France buried in the Invalides and one of the most celebrated bêtes noires of the French establishment in the 20th century. And yet, of course, there's scope for arguing that Genet is indeed an establishment radical around whom the energies of contestation cluster and are contained. As early as his Journal du Voleur, published in 1848, Genet protests his francophobia. Exclu par ma naissance et par mes goûts d'un ordre social, je n'en distinguais pas la diversité. J'en admirais la parfaite cohérence qui me refusait. J'étais stupéfait devant un édifice si rigoureux dont les détails se comprenaient contre moi. Cet ordre redoutable, redouté, avait un sens, mon exil. He's saying, I could see no diversity in a social order from which I was excluded by virtue of my birth. I admired the perfect coherence that rejected me. I was amazed at how the internal structures of that edifice worked so cohesively against me. Western bourgeois order and the narrator's self-identity, then, are depicted as imbricated opposites. The former guarantees and requires a marginalization that is precisely shaped and defined by this essentialized, unshakable coherence. Yet the implication in the self-portrait is that the perception of a social monolith masks an underlying heterogeneity. And additionally, that constructing the enemy of bourgeois consensus and articulating the discourse of cultural betrayal are essential to the theatre of disaffection that Genet promotes. Thus we have an assiduous cultivation of the concept de France, squashed by the whole notion of France, often echoes the tidy binarism we've seen in Gauguin's schematic self-portrait. Yet my contention would be that Genet also gets beyond these more hackneyed, predictable forms of iconoclasm, and indeed that he demonstrates an awareness of his own limits and of the constraints inherent in cultural dissidence. The text of his that I want to consider now is his last work, Un captif amoureux, published in 1986, a month after his death, and about a quarter of a century on from his last play. The work in which Genet promotes the cause of the Palestinians comprises elements of travelogue, autobiography, ethnography, and political and philosophical speculation. It's worth noting in passing that it was Yasser Arafat who invited Genet to write on behalf of the Palestinians, and indeed at the time of Genet's death, Arafat praised him for his contribution to the Palestinian cause. Unlike his exoticist predecessors, Genet's theoretical awareness was highly developed. He picks up repeatedly, not only on language's inherent ideological contamination, but also on the likely limits of his own interventions as an outsider in Middle Eastern politics. He's intrigued by the threshold between inside and outside, and strives to uncover the interconnectedness between the two. He questions the separation of self and other, and infers the porosity of these two categories. The margins, he argues, become the space in which access to what society rejects becomes possible. Genet likens ethnic and national division to forms of theatre that accommodate privileged inclusions and aggressive exclusions. In particular, he cites the disputed occupied territories in Israel. For Genet, this interstitial location is the place of possibility, the place of enrichment, the place of plenitude. The intolerant Jacobin, he says, within us, who insists on defending borders, must disappear as we approach the border, along which and beyond which relationality is possible. Genet's findings confirm indirectly that the much-touted betrayal of the Occident in Loti and Gauguin is indeed essentially fantastic projection and distortion. Indeed, one can find ample evidence that however seduced, however captive the Western observer of the title Un captif amoureux might be, there is a genuine attempt at self-scrutiny and theorization, even if this is tied in with self-deprecation and abuse of mockery. Jeunet sets himself up as an escort to his reader, working to disabuse his public. He criticizes the ways in which the Palestinian camps, with their variegated colors and desert locations, have become aestheticized and appropriated by Western media. He writes, "We oughtn't to have let their ornamental appearance persuade us that the tents were happy places. We shouldn't," he says, "be taken in by sunny photographs in glossy magazines. A gust of wind blew the canvas, the zinc and the corrugated iron, all blown away, and I saw the misery plain." Jeunet thus rejects those commodified images of difference. The West's visual sense is indulged and pampered, and a screen thrown over the dereliction that it persistently views as a distant mythical community. The peripheral is thus divested of political impact and trivialized as bizarre spectacle. Similarly, Palestinian freedom fighters who die for the cause satisfy the imperious appetite of Western television, which remains indifferent to notions of authentic self-sacrifice. And Jeunet adds that we remain ensconced in our comfortable domestic interiors, turning the page of the newspaper or switching channels to shut out Asia. The armchair spectator thus performs daily banal acts of political exclusion. Sensitive to the ethics of writing about the other, Jeunet wonders what perception the Palestinians might have had of him. Mais de cette tête blanche, blanche par sa peau, ses cheveux, sa barbe non rasée, blanche, rouge et ronde, toujours présente au milieu d'eux, que voulait-il faire? In converting himself into the object of the Palestinian gaze, he inverts the Eurocentric logic that turns the East into spectacle. Reminiscing about his campaigning on behalf of the Black Panthers in the late 60s and early 70s, Jeunet writes enthusiastically and in an undisguisedly romantic and confessional style. He writes, "It was like the fulfillment of an old childhood dream, in which strangers, foreigners, but probably more like me than my own compatriots, opened up a new life to me. This childishness, almost innocence, was forced on me by the Panthers' kindness, which it seemed to me they bestowed on me not as a special favor, but because it was natural to them. To be adopted like a child when one was an old man was very pleasant. It brought me real protection and education in affection." We can, of course, object here that the chosen antidote to his solipsism is another dreamlike fantasy. One might say that this fantasy of adoption and incorporation replicates what we have already examined in Loti and Lyoté. Yet, I still want to argue that Jeunet's engagement with cultural difference is much more sustained than that shown by his predecessors. In an inversion of the colonialist topos in which the other is infantilized, Jeunet welcomes the undoing of his own emotional orphanhood. Yet crucially, he remains aware of the limits of that engagement. He rejects exemplary, you might say pious, espousal of a cause, preserving instead a zone of separateness in spite of his sense of solidarity. The isolation is acutely felt when writing, he says, surrounded by a group of freedom fighters. What separates him, he says, is not his Celtic features, nor some form of insulating goose fat, but rather a stronger armor. I quote, "I didn't belong to, never really identified with, their nation or their movement. My heart was in it, My body was in it. My spirit was in it. Everything was in it at one time or another, but never my total belief, never the whole of myself. Or to quote briefly from the French, la foi jamais totale et moi jamais en entier. This scrupulous testing of the discourse of depth and self-giving provides a gauge of Genet's empathy. While in the broad sense, white mythologies, to use Derrida's term, control the outsider, the panther, the Palestinian, Genet espouses the cause of the disenfranchised while remaining in some degree distanced from the faith, the cause, the margin. He returns to the detachment when he asks if his involvement with the struggle for civil rights in the US is not that of the, I quote, natural sham. He uses in French the term un spontané simulateur. Theatricalization, then, is central to self-image and by extension to identification with the other. Likewise, Genet sees his invitation to spend time in Palestine as a call to visit the interior of a fiction. But far from trivializing the Palestinian question, I would argue that these forthright pronouncements signal Genet's own self-critical engagement with the myth-making at work in political and ethnic exclusion. My brief conclusions on the problematics of cultural defection will be necessarily provisional. Genet writes of the Palestinians, les Palestiniens dans leur révolte ont pris ce poids. Oh, j'ai peur d'être très littéraire, mais ils ont pris le poids des toiles de Cézanne. In their revolt, he says, the Palestinians have assumed this weight. Oh, I worry about being too literary, but they have assumed the weight of Cézanne's canvases. Genet's scruples about blunting the immediacy and impact of contemporary Middle Eastern history indicate an awareness of the pitfalls facing the European who strains to access and write cultural difference. By retaining the Cézanne analogy, he indulges the desire to aestheticize. But his hesitation hints at an ethical awareness not shared by his exoticist predecessors. Of course, Genet unsettles his reader, denting European self-congratulation by drawing together stories of homosexual provocation and Palestinian violence. He regularly does this in Un Captif Amoureux, an explosion and some very provocatively homosexual outburst. But alongside such provocation, which risks appropriating the other in order to unsettle, one might say narcissistically, one's own culture, Genet indirectly proposes a retroactive education of exoticists such as Loti and Gauguin. For he problematizes the notion of unfettered access to commodified alterity. His scrupulous insistence on the autonomy of the other, and indeed on his own autonomy, is clear in his depiction of the tortured freedom fighter Hamza. The bruised body of Hamza, he notes, is not available to the Western onlooker, but rather belongs to the Palestinian people. The body thus becomes emblematic of attitudes towards the other. The urge to appropriate it is a reflex response of Eurocentrism, which Gauguin must check. Whether it be the sculptural body of the Polynesian in Gauguin, or the phantasmatic body of Loti's Asiade, the will to manipulate and control in these transracial liaisons delivers a reified alterity. Genet himself lapses into this. He converts the suffering of Hamza and Hamza's mother, for example, into an extended reflection on the Christian tradition of the Pietà, the suffering Christ and his mother. But the self-awareness of his gesture reflects, I would argue, a post-colonial evaluation. As one commentator observes, the reconfiguration of political power in the wake of decolonization entails, in the critic's words, an anguished intellectual process of dispossession. Junet's Palestinian narrative then spells a double dispossession: the marginalization of the camp dwellers and the hesitations of Junet, the European Arabophile, inhibited by memory of the West's cultural legacy. Thanks very much.